Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. In our previous lecture, we concluded discussion on balance of payments problems. We looked at the two sub-accounts of the balance of payments, the current account, the capital account, their individual determinants. We looked at how current account deficits could be viewed in different ways. That is, it could be viewed as being driven by a private sector resource deficit or a government budget deficit. And we looked at the options that were available to government, especially devaluation, in tackling current account deficit problems. But we introduced some qualifications as well, that devaluation does not work always and everywhere perfectly. Now, if some of you found the discussion on balance of payments hard to digest, I mean, there's a lot of material there, a lot of new concepts, the real exchange rate, the covered interest parity, other relationships, the withdrawals versus injections relationship that we derived, that is M minus X is equal to S minus I or I minus S plus T minus G. So those were some of the relationships that we introduced, and not all of them are easy to grasp. You need time to get comfortable with them. You need time to get comfortable with the relationship between income and balance of payments, the relationship between balance of payments deficits and exchange rates, the foreign exchange market, etc., etc. There are other links that the balance of payments has, that is with monetary policy, etc., which we haven't covered yet, but we will get a chance to look at those once we look at monetary policy. But don't worry if you find the balance of payments concepts difficult, because we will try to review them as we go along. Once we look at the different interrelationships between these four problems, that is unemployment, inflation, balance of payments problems, and growth, once we look at the interactions between these four problems, we'll get a chance to look at how balance of payments problems are associated or related with unemployment problems, growth issues, inflation, etc. So hopefully things will become clearer as we go along. And then finally, in the last lecture, second last or third last lecture, we'll talk about international finance and cover those dimensions that we haven't covered at this basic level. Now, our next topic, the final of the four problems that we are discussing, is economic growth. And originally I had told you that this was not a very difficult topic, would be easy to handle. But then when I was looking at some of the material that I could potentially give you, and there's a lot of potential there, I thought I'd make it that just a little bit harder for you, so that you don't feel that the topic is unchallenging after balance of payments. So I've done that, and I'll explain why I've done that. The growth lecture, that the 1.5 lecture that I will be giving you on this topic, will not be of the level that is taught at the introductory level in economics. Some of the material that I will be handling is covered in third year undergraduate courses in economics, or even first year graduate courses. So this is advanced material. The reason that I've taken the liberty to introduce this material is that some of you have already covered calculus, and so it will be not very difficult for you to be able to follow the mathematics of growth, which is what I will be dwelling upon later on in the lecture. Two specific reasons that I have introduced this advanced material is that it is not possible to talk elegantly about the intuition that growth theory offers without really going into the mathematics of it. There are a lot of computations, calculations. You can talk about the implications of growth theory through graphs, but sometimes you need to go into the mathematics. It becomes clearer that way. So that was one reason. In order to lend clarity to your understanding of growth, I will be talking about the maths. The other reason is that I would like to introduce you to what economics looks like or might look like in your later courses or more advanced stages if you wanted to take the subject further. And hopefully some of you would like to do that. So if you wanted to know or have an inkling about what economics teaching would look like, let's say in the third year of undergraduate degree, for 3-year undergraduate degree, or the fourth year, or what it would look like at the first year of graduate degree, then this is a good idea. It's covering some of the ground, some of the foundations that are used in virtually the analysis of all different issues at those levels. So it's a good, I think, pointer to what you might confront in economics further down the road. So those are the two reasons why the discussion in this lecture and a half will be a little bit more advanced than is normally expected at the introductory level, at the undergraduate level, that is. Now, when we talk about economic growth, we are essentially referring to the rate of change of gross domestic product or gross national product, or some measure of total national output or total national income. Now, in our discussion on national income accounting, where we introduce these various terms, gross domestic product, gross national income, net national product, etc., we said that these were not the best measures of welfare, or by no means were they comprehensive measures of the living standards, the average living standards in a country, or the average welfare in any country. There were issues that related to income distribution, how the growth or the total output or total income was distributed in the economy. There were environmental externalities. There were certain goods and bads which weren't included in the gross domestic product figure. Then we looked at how different countries might value leisure differently. Gross domestic product or income basically measures the ability of people to consume things. But people can also use their time to consume leisure, right? So if some people value leisure more, they might be happier with a lower level of gross domestic product. So there were all these deficiencies, so to speak, with the definition of gross domestic product, and that it was not a complete measure of welfare or well-being of a society. However, we will keep those issues aside, and we will just look at the gross domestic product figure as the least worst measure of welfare or well-being in any economy. And it is the least worst measure. There are other measures, but they have not, some of those have greater deficiencies or bigger deficiencies, are difficult to quantify, and therefore not so pliable once you come to theoretical thinking and development of ideas on growth. So we'll be restricting our discussion to gross domestic product. That is the measure of income or output that we will be referring to. And when we talk about economic growth, we will be talking about the growth in this particular variable, that is gross domestic product. However, let me make a few qualifications here. We will be nuancing our approach a little bit. We'll be informing it by these three distinctions. That is the distinction between actual versus potential GDP. We look at the distinction between real versus nominal GDP, and I think most of you are already familiar with this. And we look at the distinction between aggregate and per capita GDP. Let me go a little further into what these three distinctions are and why they are important. Now let's start by looking at the distinction between actual and potential GDP. So far we've not introduced this distinction, but in growth analysis or understanding how well the economy is performing, this distinction is important. Now actual GDP or actual output basically measures the actual level of activity or the actual level of output or income in the economy. Whereas potential GDP is related to the maximum possible level of activity that the economy could utilize or could have if it utilized its resources optimally, that is to the fullest possible extent. So the potential GDP in a way provides the ceiling for actual GDP. Actual GDP can rise up to the ceiling of potential GDP, but it usually is below that because of distortions in the economy and suboptimal utilization of resources. Let's illustrate this distinction between actual and potential GDP by looking at something we talked about, I think, in the very first lecture, the production possibilities frontier. Let's go to our first graph for today. Now, as you can see in this production possibilities frontier, we have good M on the vertical axis and good A on the horizontal axis. Earlier we used any two goods X and Y, but here we've used M and A to represent a manufactured good, that is a manufacture like clothes or shoes or machines, whereas on the horizontal axis you could have agricultural goods. And this is just to reflect the production trade-off that any economy faces. That is, it can either focus on agricultural production, crops, etc., or it can focus towards the production of manufactures. So this makes more sense than using any goods, apples or tomatoes. For the overall economy, it makes more sense to use goods which are more aggregated in the productive sense. So M and A on the vertical and the horizontal axes. The typical shape of the production possibilities frontier is shown, is PPF1. Now there are a number of points to note about this. Points on the PPF, B, C, D, reflect in a way the potential of the economy. That is, the actual production in the economy cannot be beyond the PPF frontier. That is, cannot be beyond point D or beyond point B or beyond point C. It has to be within this frontier. Actual GDP could be anything, could take on any point either on the frontier or inside the frontier. So A is a feasible point. It's inefficient, but it is a feasible point as far as actual GDP is concerned. And then D, B, and C would also be possible points, but at D, B, and C, actual and potential GDP would align. Now, a move from A to B would be an increase in actual GDP, not potential GDP. This is the important point to note. So when the economy grows from point A to point B, and note that when the economy grows, it produces more of both good A and good M, then that is equivalent to economic growth. When that happens, the actual GDP increases, but the potential GDP was B before and is still B. So there's no change in potential GDP. However, let's look at this new PPF frontier. This is PPF2. Now a move from point B to point E reflects a change in potential GDP. That is, the potential of the economy has increased from the earlier frontier PPF1 to the new frontier PPF2. A move from B to E is therefore an increase in potential GDP, whereas a move from, let's say, A to B or A to E would be an increase in actual GDP. Now, from the discussion onwards, we will not discriminate between actual and potential GDP. We will sort of forget about potential GDP and look at the scenario in which actual and potential GDP align. So when we talk about GDP, we will assume that it refers to both actual and potential GDP. And again, this is just to simplify the analysis, but you should know at the back of your minds that there is a distinction between actual and potential. For some countries, the gap might be very small. So for countries which are already using their resources in a very efficient manner and full manner, the gap between actual and potential GDP might be very small. But for some countries where there is large unemployment of resources, of labor, of capital, of land, then the potential and actual GDP might diverge quite a bit. So that was one point. The other point is that what are the things that change GDP? The traditional thinking on this is that GDP growth can be generated either by an increase in the factors of production, that is, if the labor force increases, if the stock of capital increases, if your land increases, natural resources increase, that's one. And the other one is that you are able to make more productive or better use of the available resources. So if productivity increases, labor productivity increases, machine productivity increases, your per hectare yields of crop production, let's say, go up, those would also raise GDP. That's the traditional thinking on output growth, and we introduced it when we were discussing the production possibilities frontier earlier on. So these are all factors, these two are all factors which will push the PPF outwards. Push the PPF outwards, that is, increase the potential of the economy. That's one point. Let's now talk about trade cycles. I want to talk about trade cycles because they help illustrate how the GDP growth rate varies when the economy is at different stages. This is the last stage at which we will still be able to see the difference between actual and potential GDP. So it will consolidate your understanding of this distinction. So let's go to a slide which illustrates what a trade cycle is and how the GDP growth rate relates to it. Now, a trade cycle simply plots the actual output or the actual GDP of an economy against time. So this could be any economy in this graph. We looked at the trade cycle, if you remember, of the United States, which was an upward sloping cycle when we were comparing the volatility of investment with the volatility of GDP in our discussion of investment at the start of the macroeconomics lectures. So this is another example of a simplified example of what a trade cycle could look like. Note that there is a ceiling on top, a potential output ceiling, which is also increasing. That is, it is increasing at a constant rate. Again, simplified here. There is no compulsion for the line to be a straight line. It could be a curve which is concave or convex. But anyway, the important thing to note is that the potential GDP or the potential output provides a ceiling for actual output fluctuations. Now, what is happening to the GDP growth rate at these different points of the cycle? As you know, the cycle first falls, then goes up, reaches point 3, then comes back again, reaches point 1, then goes up again to point 3, etc., etc. Well, the relationship between GDP growth rate and the different points on the cycle is simple. When the GDP growth rate is positive and high, the country experiences a boom. When the GDP growth rate is low or sometimes even negative, the country experiences a recession. The cycle of booms and recessions is simply called the trade cycle. So point 3 here is a point which is associated with a boom, whereas point 1 would be a point which is associated with a recession. Now, as you can see, there are 4 phases of this trade cycle. The first phase is the upturn, and that's point 1. In this stage, the economy, a stagnant economy, that is a non-growing economy, begins to recover, and growth in actual output resumes or starts again. So it is at this point that the economy begins to grow. Then you have the boom. That is, during this phase, there is a rapid economic growth. The GDP growth rate, as you can see, is maximum. The slope of the actual output line is maximum at this stage. That is, the economy is growing very fast. So during this phase, there is rapid economic growth. A fuller use is made of resources, and the gap between actual and potential output narrows. Now, another stage of the boom is called the peaking out. Peaking out basically means that you have reached the peak at point 3. That is, you will not be able to go any higher. During this phase, growth slows down or even ceases, that is, stops. Then this is followed by the slowdown, and this is, in other words, also called the recession or slump, and this is the start of the recessionary phase. And during this phase, there is little or no growth or even a decline in output. Increasing slack develops in the economy, that is, there is increasing unemployment and suboptimal utilization of resources. Note that points like 2 and 3 are associated with the boom segment of the trade cycle, whereas points such as 4 and 1 are associated with the bust or the recession part of the economic or trade cycle. A word of caution is needed here, and that is that you should not confuse a high level of output with a high growth in output. The level of actual output, as you can see in the graph, is highest in phase 3, but the growth rate in actual output, that is the slope of this actual output curve, is maximum in phase 2. So that discussion helps illustrate the distinction between actual and potential output. Now we can move to the other distinction, which was between real and nominal output. Now note that in the discussion so far, we've talked about output as if there was no distinction between real and nominal output. But note that we were talking about the quantity of goods that could be produced. The production possibilities frontier relates the quantities of agricultural goods and the manufactured goods, or any two goods that are produced in the economy, right? So we are not talking about the price level in there. We're not talking about the prices of those two goods anywhere. We're only talking about the quantity. And this is essentially the difference between real and nominal GDP. Real GDP is nominal GDP, that is the market prices of all the final goods produced in the economy, deflated for the price level in order to give you an idea of the real level of activity in the economy, the real output that is being produced in the economy. And when you compare real GDP from time to time, that is, you compare the real GDP today with the real GDP tomorrow, then you can get a better measure of the change in the level of activity in the economy. If you compare nominal GDP figures, then you might get a misleading picture, in that you might see that the nominal GDP has gone up from, let's say, 100 to 115, but if in the process inflation has gone up by 20%, then actually there has been a contraction in the economy of 5%. So because 100 goes to 115 because of a combination of real and nominal activity. Real is the actual change in quantity, whereas nominal is the change in prices. So if you go from 100 to 115, but you know that inflation has been 20%, so you subtract that from 115 and you get 95, which means that in terms of the real activity, it has fallen by 5%. So this is a pretty important distinction. Again, during our discussion and as we build growth theory, we will be using the real GDP notion. We will not be talking about nominal GDP. So that was the second qualification. The third qualification is the distinction between aggregate GDP and per capita GDP. That is aggregate output and per capita output. Now, the problem there we noted earlier was that measures of aggregate output are not any indication of the standard of living of the average person in the economy. Even per capita output levels are not a very good measure, but they are still better than looking at just the total. And we gave the example of China and Switzerland, that China had a higher aggregate GDP than Switzerland, but if you adjusted it for the population levels in the two economies, then Switzerland was way higher. The per capita income was way higher. And the basic belief here is that the standards of living in any economy are related to per capita levels, per capita income, not aggregate income. Now, it's useful to develop some idea of what the relationship between per capita growth and aggregate growth is. Because often we are interested in both. We want to know how the aggregate economy is doing, but then we also want to relate it to how the individuals and average individuals' income is changing. We're talking about real income now. So it's useful to look at the mathematics that links the two growth rates. And this will also set the principles, the foundations for what we will be dealing with a little later when we develop growth theory. Let's go to a simple slide to illustrate how the growth rates in per capita income are related to the growth rate in aggregate income in any economy. Now let's assume here that capital Y stands for the real aggregate GDP in the economy. That is the total output that is produced in the economy, or the total income level. Whereas L is the total size of the population. Here, again, we have not made the distinction between population and the labor force. We assume for simplicity that they are the same. But as you know, in actuality, there is a difference. So we use the same symbol for population as we use for labor force. But that's okay. So we have Y, capital Y is equal to total GDP, total real GDP, and L as total population. Small y then becomes the per capita GDP for any individual in the economy, right? Simply the total GDP divided by the number of people in the economy. Now, in order to get the relationship, the growth rate relationship, we can take logs of both sides, natural logs. So that will give you ln y is equal to ln capital Y minus ln L, right? Simple relationship in logarithmic form. Then what you can do is you can differentiate both sides with respect to time, right? And what do you get if you do that? Well, you'll simply get dy by dt whole divided by y is equal to d capital Y by dt whole divided by capital Y minus dl by dt whole divided by L. So that's the relationship that you get after differentiating. But note that this left-hand side, which is dy d small y by dt whole over small y, is nothing but the growth rate of the per capita income. Why is it the growth rate? Because it's the change, the instantaneous change in the income, the per capita income, that is d small y by dt, divided by the level of the per capita income. And that's exactly what the definition of a growth rate is. That is change in the variable divided by the level of a variable. So if the GDP grows from y to y1, then the growth rate would be calculated as y1 minus y over y. And this is exactly what is happening here. dy over dt measures the instantaneous change in the level of per capita income, whereas y, which appears in the denominator, captures the level of the per capita income, which gives therefore the growth rate in small y. Similarly, on the right hand side, we have g capital Y minus g capital L. And this establishes the simple but powerful relationship between the growth rates of per capita income and the growth rate of total income and the growth rate of the population. Note that as the growth rate of the population increases, that is if GL increases, then the growth rate of per capita income would fall. However, for any given growth rate of labor or population, any increase in G capital Y would raise per capita income, that is increase the growth rate of per capita income. At a point where G capital Y is equal to G capital L, then that would be the point where G small y is equal to 0. That is per capita income growth is 0. That is the ratio Y over L is not changing. The ratio capital Y over L is not changing over time. That is Y is constant over time. Now note that if Y small y was equal to capital Y over L, then the relationship between the growth rates was that G small y was equal to G capital Y minus GL. However, if you have two variables such as which are multiplied together, let's say Z is equal to X multiplied by Y, then the growth rate in Z would be equal to the growth rate in X plus the growth rate in Y. Follows from the same process. You take the logs, in that case you will get an addition of two logarithmic terms, and then when you differentiate it, you will get the growth rate. So you will have additive growth rates giving you the growth rate in Z. So keep that simple but important calculation in mind when we look at growth theory later on. Now, what are typical growth rates for economies of the world? It's always useful to develop an upfront idea of what types of growth rates are happening around us. Well, an economy which is growing very fast will usually grow at something like 8 to 10%. For example, many East Asian economies, tiger economies as they are called, and China more recently, have grown at 8 to 10% GDP, real GDP growth rates. I'm talking about aggregate growth rates over a number of decades. And the implication of that is that if the growth rate of population is not very large, then that can translate in a huge increase in the growth of per capita income. And that means that there will be a huge increase in average living standards. What would be a moderate but good growth rate? Well, something between 4 to 7%, 4 to 6% would be a moderate but good growth rate. And Pakistan has been in that range between 5 to 7% earlier on, more recently around the 5%, 4-5% mark. Those are decent growth rates, but probably not enough for a poor country to grow out of its poverty, especially when its growth rate of population is high. What about developed and advanced countries? Well, most developed countries, which are mature economies, already have a very high level of output, usually grow between 2% and 3%. That's the normal growth rate for countries in Europe, in North America, and other OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's the group of advanced countries, industrialized countries in the world, about 20, I think 2021. And those countries all have usually growth rates between 2 to 3%. Of course, there are some countries there like Mexico, Korea, which could have higher growth rates because they've just entered the group. But more mature European economies usually grow at around that rate. Now, as we did for some of the earlier problems that we discussed, inflation, unemployment, it's useful to develop some idea of the history of growth. And for this, I will introduce some selected growth statistics for you. It will also include some statistics for Pakistan. But since we want to look at what are the implications of growth over a long period of time, let's say 100 years or 150 years, then we need to look at the economies or the countries which have existed for so long. You know, Pakistan has only been around for 50 odd years, but other countries have been there for longer, and they had growth accounting done since a long time back. So let's look at how growth rates in these countries have translated into a massive change in the living standards. Let's look at some selected growth indicators, selected growth statistics. Now this, my friends, is a very interesting table, and this will give you an idea of the power of growth, especially when it is experienced over a fairly long period of time. The period that we will be considering is from 1870 to 1999. And the countries that we will look at is Japan, US, Australia, Sweden, France, UK, all from the pool of industrialized countries. Now let's look at the average annual growth rates that these countries experienced during these 130 odd years. The growth rate for Japan was 3.7%. This is the annual growth rate that, if compounded, would produce the level of activity, the level of GDP that Japan has today from 1870 to 1999. The annual cumulative growth rate for the US was 3.4%, for Australia 3.1%, for Sweden 2.8%, France 2.2%, and UK 1.9%. Note that the UK has the lowest growth rate, and this is not surprising because at the time of the start of this period, 1870, the UK was already a mature economy. It had become the most advanced economy in the world, and as I mentioned earlier, as economies become more and more advanced and developed, their growth rate tapers off. That is, it becomes lower and between the 2 to 3% range. Now the important column to note here is that of the ratio of the 1999 level of real GDP to the 1870 level of GDP in these economies. And as you can see, Japan's economy over this 130-year period has expanded by 100 times, right? US's economy has expanded by 66 times, Australia 43 times, Sweden 33 times, France 15 times, and UK 10 times. And this is these are phenomenal expansion rates. I mean, imagine a country expanding its GDP or level of activity by 100 times over a period of 130 years. Now, how does this translate in terms of per capita real GDP? Well, we have figures on those as well. As you can see, the annual growth rates, per capita growth rates for these countries over the same period of time, 1870 to 1999, were 2.7% for Japan, 1.8% for US, 1.2% for Australia, 2.2% for Sweden, France 1.9%, and UK 1.3%. And the equivalent impact on the level of per capita real GDP, that is the ratio of the 1999 level to the 1870 level, gives us a 27 times increase In per capita real GDP for Japan, 10 times for US, 4 times for Australia, 14 times for Sweden, 10 times for France, 5 times for UK. So if per capita real GDP were taken as a measure of the well-being or living standards in these countries, Japan experienced a 27 times increase, US a 10 times, Sweden 14 times. So those are the leading countries there. Whereas countries like Australia and the UK did not experience that great an increase in the level of per capita real GDP, mainly because I think the aggregate growth rate, real growth rate in the UK was low, 1.9%, and probably because the population growth rate for Australia was higher than some of the other countries. Australia, as you can see, had a pretty high aggregate annual growth rate of 3.1%, but in terms of the annual growth rate in per capita GDP, there's a big reduction from 3.1% to 1.2%, which meant that the population of Australia must have been growing by 1.9%. And this population growth rate is higher than any of the other countries. Now let's see what was happening in Pakistan since our independence. So there is some statistics on the average growth rates or growth trends in Pakistan, both for the aggregate real GDP and per capita real GDP over the last 4 decades, that is the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And these are taken from Akbar Zaidi's book, Issues in Pakistan's Economy, that I suggested, as you know, in the first lecture. The growth rates are shown here as that the real GDP growth rate was 6.7% in the 60s, fell to 4.8% in the 70s, rose again to 6.4% in the 80s, and then fell to about 4.7% in the 90s. Whereas the per capita GDP growth rate for these 4 decades was 4% in the 60s, 1.7% in the 70s, 3.3% in the 80s, and 2% in the 90s, which implies that the population growth rate must have been 2.7% in the 60s, 3.1% in the 70s, 3.1% in the 80s, and 2.7% in the 90s. So clearly, faster growth in living standards or per capita income during the 1980s and the 1960s compared to the 1970s and the 1990s. So my friends, with a good idea of what the growth statistics were in some advanced economies and also in Pakistan, we can now move to some study or some discussion on theories about what could cause economic growth. And the first thing to think about is the factors of production. As you know, we are talking about gross domestic product. So the growth in gross domestic product should be driven by the factors which allow us to produce, that is, to produce the products that we are consuming. And the factors that have been identified here are capital, represented by K, labor, represented by L, land, which is just shown as land, then raw materials, RM, then technical knowledge. This is a new factor that we've introduced that we haven't talked about. So let's discuss these factors a little bit in order before we move to a discussion of the two growth theories that we will turn to in a short while. Capital. Now, for any given level of labor and other factors, any increase in capital should cause an increase in output, should permit an increase in output. So if there were 3 machines earlier and now there are 5 machines, those 5 machines should be able to produce more output than those 3 machines. But capital runs into diminishing returns because the other factors are fixed, and because we assume diminishing returns to any individual factor. As you increase the level of capital employed in the economy, then you assume diminishing returns. At least this is the traditional thinking, or was the traditional thinking for growth. Therefore, the argument was that capital cannot generate indefinite growth. That is, after a while, growth will cease. Why will growth cease? For 2 reasons. One is that capital depreciates over time. So any increase in capital has to be partly devoted to making up or replenishing for the capital that has depreciated, that has lost in value. So machines wear out, due to wear and tear, and they need to be brought back to their original condition or replaced totally. So some of the investment or some of the capital has to just simply go to keeping the capital at the same level, that is making up for the depreciated capital. The other thing is that in order to maintain the capital to labor ratio constant, then an increasing amount of capital is needed as the labor size of the population increases. So as more and more people are born, in order to maintain the same capital to labor ratio, you need more and more capital simply devoted to that. And as we will see in setting up the growth theory, the neoclassical growth theory, it is capital per labor which is basically a determinant of output per labor, that is per capita income. So those are the 2 points important about capital. Part of the capital has to go to covering for depreciation and for making up for the increase in population. And this is broadly called capital widening. That is, you are widening the base over which capital is distributed. And that capital or investment is being devoted to just keeping the capital to labor ratio constant. The other thing is capital deepening. Capital deepening happens when the K over L ratio increases. That is, there is more capital per worker. And when this happens, we will see that output per worker also increases. The next important factor is labor, L. And as we discussed in our section on unemployment, there is a difference between the population and the labor force. And there is a difference between the labor force and the AJ, that is the people, that part of the labor force willing to accept jobs. But there is another difference, and that is the number of hours that AJ part of the labor force supplies. It is possible for the level of activity in the economy to go up if people were made more willing to work, that is to work harder. And we saw some ways of doing that, that is by reducing the marginal income tax rate, which increased the incentive to earn the extra dollar, and therefore that might encourage people to work the extra hour. So that's just one small additional point. Second point is about human capital. It is not just the quantity of labor that is offered or the hours of labor that is important for the growth in the economy. It's also the quality of labor that is being offered. So you could have people who are highly inefficient, incompetent, but a large number of them, and they might not be as good as maybe a few people, but who are highly skilled and highly competent. So the learning, the techniques, the skill that is embodied in people is referred to as human capital. And this has been seen as the engine of growth in many countries. If you take the example of West Germany, most of West Germany's physical capital was destroyed after the Second World War. But their human capital survived. And it was the human capital which used the funding that came through the Marshall Plan, that is loans that were given by the US to Germany, which used that money to rebuild Germany to the state that it is today. It's again a highly advanced, industrialized and prosperous country. So human capital, very important. Now the third factor is land. And this was considered a pretty important factor, and perhaps the most important factor when the world was principally an agrarian world. That is, most of the production that happened was in the farms, and people were concerned with the production of food. And the argument provided by one Reverend Malthus in the late 18th century in the UK was that people would starve. That is, the land that was available to grow crops was limited, but the size of the population was increasing, and therefore inevitably some people would starve. But this did not happen, as you can see in the 19th and 20th century. People did not starve. Some countries did suffer. Some developing countries did sort of go through episodes of starvation when their population levels increased and production of crops did not. But in most advanced countries, and this thesis was presented in the context of advanced countries, did not see periods of starvation. Why? The simple argument was that in the 19th century, early 19th century, there were improvements in productivity, agricultural productivity, that is the labor productivity that produced crops, etc. And that allowed some of the labor to be devoted to the production of capital and machinery in the economy. So those people helped produce things like the tractors, helped work to produce fertilizers, and these things in turn raised the agricultural productivity manyfold. So there was an initial increase in productivity which allowed some of the laborers to be taken into the industrial part of the economy. And then industrial developments increased agricultural productivity manyfold. And so the same amount of land could be used to produce many times the crops or many times the wheat and rice that were produced earlier. So land, not really a big issue in growth thinking today. Some countries which have been very small, like Hong Kong, have still managed to attain very high levels of growth, both in aggregate and per capita levels, simply because they've used the scarce land very efficiently. Also, when you have capital intensive and knowledge intensive goods being produced like microchips, etc., you don't need a lot of space. You need a lot of thought, a lot of skill and intellect going into the production of those goods and thinking about the best way to produce the most cost-efficient ways. And that is why countries like Japan, which have been relatively small, and Korea have experienced such large growth rates, mainly because they've been able to use the land resources, the scarce land resources they had, more efficiently. Next we come to raw materials. Raw materials are an important input into the production process, and if the stock of raw materials increases in any economy, then naturally the amount that the economy can produce will increase. So if suddenly new oil reserves were found in Pakistan, then that would certainly allow Pakistan to produce more. It would reduce our import costs. It would allow us to redeploy our precious resources which we spend on importing oil from abroad to other things, and generally the level of production could increase. But note that there is a distinction between depletable raw materials and renewable raw materials. Depleting reserves basically indicate that when a particular raw material is used, it cannot be recovered. So when you use oil to run sort of as fuel in cars, then that fuel just sort of evaporates in the sky. It cannot be recovered. Whereas some raw materials, some types of natural resources can be recovered. For example, wood. So if you use your forests, you cut a lot of trees, then you can replant those trees, and maybe in another 25 years you would have the same stock of forests and the same supply of wood that you had 25 years earlier. Similarly, fish in a river or in a sea, then you might fish, so that would be extracting some of the resource, but as the fish multiply and again in number, then the size of the fish population could grow back to the same level. So there are renewable sources of raw material and non-renewable depleting reserves. And it's important to distinguish between them, because those reserves, those natural resources which deplete and cannot be recovered, mean that they affect the future potential growth of the economy, whereas those resources which can be renewed mean that the government can adopt strategies to ensure that the produce or the supply of those raw materials continues into the long-term future of the economy. Now, the last factor that I want to talk about, which can be an important determinant or driver of economic growth, is technical know-how or technical knowledge, the level of the stock of knowledge, technical knowledge in the economy. Now, some of this technical know-how is written in books, right? But some of it is embodied in the working methods of people. So, जिसे आप कहते हैं कारीगरी, तो हर शख्स में कोई कारीगरी होती है. सो कारीगरी के अंदर कोई अगर इम्प्रूवमेंट हो जाए, इफ देयर इज एन एडवांस, अ टेक्निकल एडवांस, then that can also lead to an increase in output and faster GDP growth rates. What factors can cause increases or such technical advance? Well, there are mainly three. One is learning by doing. Learning by doing is that when people do more and more of the same activity, they become better at doing that. तो अगर आप आज फुटबॉल खेलनी शुरू करते हैं, तो शायद आप उस तरह से अच्छी फुटबॉल ना खेल सकें, लेकिन अगर आप रोज खेलें और 3-4 साल इसी तरह खेलें, हो सकता है आप मैराडोना बन जाएं. So you get better at things as you do them more and more often, and this applies to production techniques as well. As people produce more and more, and they produce the same or involved in the same kinds of activities year after year, they become more efficient at them. So they can technological advance can happen because of learning by doing. There are two other ways in which technical advance can happen, and one is invention, which is the creation of new knowledge, and the other is innovation, that is the incorporation of that new knowledge or the incorporation of inventions into actual production methods. Now those two things, invention and innovation, don't just happen out of the air. They need to be financed. Well, fine, there are some inventions, some innovations that can take place. But generally the amount of invention and innovation happening in any economy, ईजादात और दरियाफ्तें और फिर उनको किस तरह से प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेस में शामिल किया जाए, it depends critically on the amount of funds that are available to finance R&D. As you know, any individual firm does not have the incentive to undertake research and development expenditure because the benefits of that are sometimes not immediate. And the benefits of that are also in a way that the marginal social benefit of research and development exceeds the marginal private benefit. That is, if you remember the discussion on externalities, a lower quantity of research and development would be undertaken because the marginal social benefit is higher. So how can the government ensure that a higher level or the socially optimal level of R&D expenditures is undertaken? The way to do it is through patents. That will preserve the incentive to undertake R&D. And patents are basically equivalent to property rights. That is, if you create something, then you have the sole rights for a certain number of years to sell that product at the price that you wish to. The other way that the government can encourage R&D in order to assist innovation and invention and speed these two things up is by financing R&D expenditures or subsidizing R&D expenditures itself. So it can have research and development grants, and it can give them to universities or firms and help them sort of conduct their research and development in order to ensure that the optimal level of research and development happens and that invention and innovation constantly happen. The growth that has been witnessed in the developed countries is primarily due to invention and innovation. It has not been due to the additions of capital. Well, that they have had a role to play, but the most important source has been technical advance. So those, my friends, were the 4 or 5 factors which drive economic growth. In our next lecture, we will develop 2 theories, the exogenous growth theory and endogenous growth theory, briefly, but with the right mathematical rigor in order to consolidate the existing thinking on growth and how it has evolved over time. So, my friends, we come to the end of our lecture for today. Well, the discussion today has been quite simple. We've just introduced the initial ideas. We'll develop these further in our next lecture. The things to take home and that we will revisit in our next lecture are concepts about capital deepening, capital widening. That is, using more and more capital to distribute over a larger labor force, or actually increasing the capital to labor ratio. We'll also look at the diminishing returns diminishing returns to factor assumption that is related to how the output responds to increasing quantities of a particular factor being employed. So based on those things, we will come back to growth in our next lecture. Till then, it will have to be Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.